I think we should just get started. Ruth, please. We will first have 30 minutes from Ruth, 30 to 5 minutes, and then Anja will comment, and then we'll have a short break before we go on to Steve and Sandberg.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation to come here, and Paul for the fantastic organization, so that everything went very well. And I'm very honored to be asked to speak here. This is obviously a very interdisciplinary event because I'm a linguist and a communication scholar. And then we have a criminologist, and we have the Sociological Association. So I think that makes a lot of sense because such complex topics like right-wing populism and the extreme right really deserve such a interdisciplinary investigation and study, as they various perspectives result in various insights. So what I will do today is basically first talk a bit about my book, which you kindly mentioned, and my theoretical framework about the politics of fear. And then I want to give some examples which relate to my title here, The Establishment, the Elites, and the People, Who's Who, because I think that right now these concepts are sort of floating around in an interesting way. I don't like the notion of la clau of the empty signifier, because everything always has a meaning whenever you talk about it. But it's interesting in what way we are all now talking about where we belong to and who the people are and who the establishment is and so forth. So I think it's important to clarify these notions. And finally, I will talk a bit about the concept of normalization, which we currently see happening very strongly in France, with Marine Le Pen actually being invited on big talk shows and being treated as one of us, which has never been the case in France and rarely in the UK. I remember very well the one big event on BBC Question Time when Nick Griffin was from the BNP was invited for the first time on this big event and program. So I think we need to reflect on what this means for the mainstream and for social categories and for our societies. So first I want to briefly just comment on what I think are the most important dimensions of right-wing populism. Obviously, there are many labels floating around. You have populism, radical right, right-wing populism, extreme right, etc., etc. Let me just talk about right-wing populism. I will define what I mean with this and restrict the label extreme right to those parties which actually also use violence and have paramilitary organizations like the Golden Dawn in Greece or the Jobbik in Hungary and others. So that for me is the distinction, but I'm sure, as people have said, Kasmude and others, there are about 30 terms we could use, so I don't want to get into this terminological discussion. So for me, there are 4 dimensions which are very important for defining such right-wing populist movements or parties. The first one is an extraordinary nationalism which draws on nativism. That means you have to be born there and your parents have to be born there, so it goes strongly back to a blood and soil ideology. That also includes the imaginary of a homogeneous nation. So the nation is sort of, oh, we are all the same, usually white, and these nations consist of the real Finns or the real Austrians, the real Brits, and they are defined in a certain way. And in this way, all these parties are absolutely anti-pluralist. So that is, I think, a very important factor. And on top of this, the nation or the demos, the folk, is defined in a very arbitrary way. So you can always include somebody or exclude somebody. Yeah? But basically, the right-wing populist leaders see themselves as representatives of this homogeneous folk, which is defined by being born there and their parents already born there and speaking the mother tongue and all these issues. So that goes back to some ideologies of blood and soil and Volkskörper, yeah, and the body of the people and so forth. The second very important dimension is the anti-elitism, which is connected to anti-intellectualism. I see a lot of sort of appeals to the people. The people just know. You don't need experts, you don't need knowledge, you don't need liberals, you don't need intellectuals, you don't need the establishment, whoever that might be. You don't need the privileged up there, although usually the leaders come exactly from these establishment and privileged classes. I mean, Trump is the best example for this, but also other leaders, of course, are good examples. So the combination of anti-elitism and anti-pluralism means that you have a cleavage towards certain people who you exclude inside the society and some people you exclude coming from outside. So it's a very exclusionary definition of the nation. The third point, which is linked to that, is authoritarianism, sort of a strong emphasis on law and order politics and on securitization, of course now ever more justified by terrorism, but that was also the case before we had 9/11, etc. I should mention that right-wing populism is not new at all. The Austrian right-wing populist party was founded in 1947, coming straight from the NSDAP, from the National Socialist Party, and the Front National, 1972. So, I mean, even though people are very surprised about Trump, for us that's not new at all. And we know sort of the ideologies and the concepts already for a long time. The interesting thing is, why are these parties so successful right now? But they have been growing for a long time. Especially also, I should mention, in small countries. It's not by chance that Denmark, Austria, Switzerland, and Norway have had such parties for a long time. And it's something we could discuss why this is the case. I have some ideas about that. And the fourth dimension is conservatism, which means that there is a notion of values, sort of the old cleavages of left and right don't work in this way. It's emphasis on values. And so you have a going back to very traditional gender politics, for example. This is very obvious in the United States, but it's also obvious in Poland and Hungary. Less obvious, let's say, in the Netherlands and in Scandinavia. You have a strong family orientation in some of the countries. These parties are homophobic. Russia, Ukraine, Poland, for example. So you have a very value connotated party system and less falling into the traditional dimensions of what we used to call left and right. Of course, these four dimensions are combined in different ways, and that's very context dependent. Right now in Europe, we observe 29 right-wing populist parties, including Russia right now. And beyond Europe, of course, you also have these parties. And some parties are much more progressive, like the Dutch are certainly not homophobic. but in some ways they combine these four dimensions in very context-dependent ways and also historically dependent. There's a big difference between those parties which stem from fascist and National Socialist previous movements, like in Hungary, in Austria, in Germany, and Italy, and parties which don't, which don't have these roots in the 1920s and 30s. So who are these people? Just to show you faces, which of course you see on the newspapers every day, and I don't have to introduce all of them, but the one in the middle you might not know, that is H.C. Strache, that's the leader of the Austrian Freedom Party, by the way, currently standing at 34%, and probably will win at the next national election. Frauke Petri up there was the leader of the AfD, Aktion für Deutschland, and has been ousted right now some weeks ago, might come back, you don't know. And actually now the AfD, the Aktion für Deutschland, is really going into a very, very extreme right direction. Gerd Wilders is probably well known. Then the Italian guy here in the middle is obviously doesn't fall exactly in this right-wing populist schema. He is certainly a populist from his rhetoric, but he embraces various aspects which do not fall totally in these four dimensions. He's less xenophobic, but very much protectionist. So it's a different kind of, Beppe Grillo is a bit a different guy. And then Marine Le Pen, you know, and Nigel Farage, I'm sure Steve will talk more about him. So my questions today is, how are these right-wing populist politics performed in the everyday life? We have a lot of macro sociological theories, which I also don't want to list right now, but when we are confronted with everyday performances in the media and in interviews, etc., it's important to know why they are so successful. How do they convey their agenda in the everyday performances, in the election campaigns, etc.? And that's what I'm really interested in. So my assumptions for this talk, and I'm sorry those arrows are a bit wrong because I write on PC and not on Mac, so there's always some difficulties in transformation. But my fundamental assumptions are that all right-wing populist parties of whatever kind instrumentalize certain minorities as scapegoats to blame for certain big problems. It's a very simplistic way to explain problems, and that they construct fear. And there's somebody to blame, like we have the financial crisis, and we have the Eurozone crisis, and security and terrorism and whatnot. And right now it's the refugees. Yeah? Before, other times it was sort of the migrants from the former Eastern communist countries after 1989, and before that it was the Jews and the Roma. And so this is a pattern. It's very easy to define scapegoats and to construct them as guilty for whatever big problems, and to sort of exaggerate these issues or actually construct these problems, and then to promise to solve these problems. Yeah, and this pattern of the savior, again, is not new, but that is exactly what these politicians do. So they will make America great again, or Austria, or whatever country. And the interesting thing about that is also the notion of again. That means turning the clock back. You have a nostalgia for something which was before. And so these parties are usually not directed towards sort of progress and future, but very much to the past, to change it back, yeah, like London was before. There are very interesting posters of the BNP London now is diverse, and you can change it back to how London was before, namely white. And so this sort of nostalgia is very characteristic. And they promise to be the voice of the people, and I will really emphasize this voice of the people, because the appeal to the people, which are arbitrarily defined, who is included and who's excluded, is constitutive for these parties. I also, as I already said, that is linked a lot to the notion of direct appeals to the people. The people know we don't need democratic institutions, representatives, etc., knowledge. People just know what is good for them. And I call that in my book the arrogance of ignorance. And it was particularly visible when analyzing Sarah Palin and some people in the Tea Party. It just doesn't matter if you don't know something. Actually, you're quite proud that you don't know. Jonathan Friedland from The Guardian has called that right now are the times of endarkenment. I think this is quite an interesting notion of post-enlightenment. We're going back to times, or we are emphasizing times where knowledge is not important. Denial of climate change is, of course, an excellent example of this. And fourthly, we are experiencing a normalization. Yeah, we're getting used to the breaking of taboos. Sort of people, there are scandals every day, there are Trump tweets every night. People just get used, and a lot of discriminatory and exclusionary rhetoric is not even noticed anymore. And I think this is something which is really worth to think about very deeply, because it means that our society becomes very insensitive to some issues. Now, who are those scapegoats right now? I think that the notion of the stranger is very important. That is, of course, a traditional sociological protagonist, the stranger, also psychological, socio-psychological. And if you look at the scholars who wrote about it, I think there's quite an interesting distinction, and we're currently confronted with both the modern and the postmodern stranger, as is claimed by Zygmunt Bauman, Simmel, and others. So the modern stranger in modernity was always the Jews. They were sort of the archetypical other inside the societies. They were never quite the same, even if they assimilated totally. They were always close, but not too close and not distant, as Simmel describes it very acutely. And right now, as Bauman says, we are confronted with the postmodern stranger. That is the privatized strangerhood, the individualized stranger, meaning the refugees who come on their own, and either they make it or they drown. But it is sort of unstable, it is individualized, and it is very distinct and weak. Right now we are actually, as I said, we see strangers inside and outside of the societies, very arbitrarily constituted by these parties and changing all the time. And in this way, we have a mixture of modern and postmodern strangers. If you look at Hungary, there is violent anti-Semitism and anti-Tsiganism, the same in Poland, and in the Ukraine and in Russia and Bulgaria. And at the same time, you have the total angst of refugees and migrants, although they have none. Poland has taken in exactly 7 refugees. So you have this sort of mixture of the construction of fear from inside and outside. Now, Bauman, in his fantastic writing, said there are 2 strategies to cope with strangers. One is to eat them up, yeah, devour them, others to spit them out if they don't assimilate. And basically, somehow our societies are right now oscillating between these two possibilities. And of course, we can discuss this afterwards, why the nation states have such different ways of coping with the refugees. I come from a country, Austria, which has taken in 90,000 refugees, although it's a very small country, whereas, as we know, the UK and other big countries, Poland, have not taken in any or very few. So Sweden has taken in even more, I think 160,000, and Germany, of course, over 1 million. So there's a big discrepancy in the EU member states, and I think this is worth discussing why this is so. So what are the strangers? And I just want to show you the impact of the media. I mean, Steve knows these tabloids from every day. When you go around in the UK, and I taught at Lancaster for over 10 years, this is what you see. This is not typical and sort of collected to show you just, you know, these extreme cases. Basically, you see these headlines every day. You see that there is the metaphors of invasion. You see that immigrants are usually characterized as murderers and rapists. You see these huge numbers. 500,000 migrants get social housing. Usually there's no evidence for all this. There's no sort of sources for that. These are claims put out in the headlines, and now if you see that every day, it disseminates, of course, and it contributes to this construction of fear, of this fantasy that we are all overwhelmed by this invasion of strangers. So this is migrants, this is not refugees, and it's important to keep those two concepts apart. So to come to these metaphors, and I only want to give you a glimpse of the linguistic analysis, and I don't want to bore you, but we have in these headlines, you see a lot of conceptual metaphors like invasion, nature catastrophes, the nation as a house, which has to be protected, yeah, and you only have doors for legal entry. And you have also dangers inside. You have the metaphors of illness, disease, parasites, and so forth. So we go back to very old conceptual metaphors, which are very important in the way we characterize and also perceive migrants, refugees, strangers inside and outside, which come mostly from the 19th century. The parasite metaphor comes from the 19th century and from the sort of beginning of nationalism. And all these metaphors were very strong in National Socialism and fascism. So if you read Mein Kampf, it's full of parasites and similar metaphors. Important also for these outsiders, yeah, the others, is that usually even if you have crossed the borders, you still carry the strangerhood in you. So the othering doesn't stop after you've crossed the borders. And there are very good studies by human geographers and others who show us how this construction of the border continues even when you already have citizenship. You still don't belong. Yeah? And this belonging, non-belonging, I think is a very important dimension in this discussion. And we see that specifically in immigration, yeah, when people who are dark get stopped and people who are white don't get stopped, even if both of them have Austrian passports, because it's just the looks. Yeah, and this probably happens elsewhere as well. So we have the metaphors. The other category I want to briefly talk about is metonymies, that is part for whole. Brussels stands for the EU. Yeah? Oslo stands for Norway. Merkel stands for Germany and a specific kind of governance. And metonymies operate to construe those as homogeneous group. Yeah? And in that way, metonymies are very important to construct these people. Something I would just like to make an aside, there was a very old study made close to Leicester by Norbert Elias and John Scottson, very famous sociologists, who actually could prove empirically, and they studied this empirically, that newcomers were juxtaposed to the people who were living there already for a long time, and those were the establishment. The establishment were those in the know who knew everything, and the newcomers were those who were stigmatized. The newcomers were also British, were also white, were also Calvinist, Anglican. They were not different. Yeah, they were also not poor. They were just new. And in this study, you have a very interesting way to see how borders and groups are constantly constructed in the fear that these people might take something away, that they threaten the routines, and everything we know well already is enough to exclude them. So you don't even have to be Muslim, yes? It already happens much before that. So I want to show you one of my quote-unquote favorite examples, which I also write about in my book. And that is a very famous poster of the Schweizer Volkspartei. Another one of these big right-wing populist parties is in Switzerland. So the interesting thing about these parties is that they are not connected primarily to the economic crisis. And they have been existing already much longer, and they exist in very rich countries which have almost not been struck by the crisis. Of course, they exist in countries which have been struck a lot by the crisis. So it's not an easy causal relationship. And Switzerland and Norway, as the richest countries in Europe, are of course an excellent example. Schweizer Volkspartei has had over 40%. Now they split and now they have less, but nevertheless they're very strong. They've been in government. They have the Swiss government rotates, so it's a different system. And this sheep poster has become very famous. That was 2007. You see here an example of what Nick Billy calls banal nationalism. So the Swiss flag is the metonymy for Switzerland. The white sheep are the good people, and the black sheep is the bad people. The white sheep throw the black sheep away out of the country. So it's innocence and evil, and you can associate all kinds of different meanings with it. And the slogan says, "We make security," yeah, or making security. So the SVP is actually emphasizing securitization. Now this motif traveled all across Europe, although these parties are very nationalistic, but nevertheless this was transnational, and it traveled to Germany, to the Nationale Partei Deutschlands, which is a neo-Nazi party. And here it says socially only goes in a national way. So here you already have the collocation of social and national. And again, you have the white sheep throwing the black sheep off. Then it goes to the Lega Nord in Italy. And the colors of the Lega Nord are green. And in that way, you have the white sheep again throwing the black sheep off. And it says, we only give residence permit to those strangers who want to work. Security in our house. So here you clearly have the metaphor of house for nation. But it doesn't stop there. Suddenly you get whole families of sheep. And you get the white sheep throwing off the family of black sheep. And it has a real Nazi slogan up there, Sippenhaft, dank SVP. That Sippenhaft means the whole family is responsible for being different. Yeah, so if the parents did something, the children are also to blame, which meant in National Socialist terms that once Jewish, always Jewish, once Roma, always Roma, once homosexual, always homosexual, etc. And here you have the family of the white throwing off the family of the black. And Nicole Durr has just published a great paper about that in Discourse in Society, and she actually found 99 examples of this sheep poster in the internet. But we go further, and now we have Golden Dawn and the blue flag, again throwing off the brown-black sheep. Maybe it's a bit different in Greece. And here we have Greece belongs to the Greeks. And then it also traveled to the Czech Republic. And there we have the campaign in Prague, Stop Criminality and Stop Immigration. Our work is not for migrants. So you see the typical examples, the typical topoi, arguments, standing arguments against migration and against the others coming from outside, condensed in such posters with these very simplistic metaphors, which then obviously lend themselves for many interpretations and are very easy to pick up. So now let's go to the us. And who are the people and who are the nations? So what I said before is that the nation, this homogeneous folk, is defined in a very arbitrary way. Just to bring you into remembrance Bush's inauguration, I will come back to that again now in 4 minutes. But what he says here is we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, elite, others, giving it back to you, the people. So the people are not Washington, and Washington are not people, right? Because that is implied in this sentence. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first, America first. And you remember, he always points his finger. There are very good studies now about Trump's gestures already. But again, this America first is not new. Jörg Haider, who was the leader of the Austrian Freedom Party, already in 1993 launched a petition called Austria First. And the first statement in this petition was, Austria is not a country of immigration. We don't want foreigners. At that time, it was against people coming from the former Eastern communist countries. So Austria didn't want Poles or Hungarians or Czechs or Romanians. Yeah? Now, of course, these are our neighbors. We like them, but now we don't want the people coming even further away. Yeah? But at that time, the same rhetorical patterns were existing against these Poles, Hungarians, etc., as now we find against the Syrians, Iraqis, and Afghans. And finally, Norbert Hofer, who was the candidate of the extreme right in Austria against the Green candidate, and he said, I will be there for the Austrians. And that is the big difference to Van der Bellen, who is the Austrian president now. I will be a president for the Austrians, so the other one not. And not the president of the Shikaria. Shikaria means the yuppies, yeah, the establishment, the elites. And it becomes clear in this television debate that this Shikaria that are not the people. Yeah? So the definition of the people means there's a certain subgroup of the people living in that country. And arbitrarily, you can exclude the Muslims, which Robert Hofer does. You can exclude other foreigners. You can exclude the Shikaria up there, and so forth. So again, to just show you, this was one of the party meetings now of the FPÖ, and they say direct democracy instead of dictates from the top. And again, you have we are the people as the most important slogan. To just show you how frequently Trump talks about the people in parts of his inauguration speech, I've just put this out there and underlined how he talks about the people. And if you look at it in more precisely, you see you have the American people opposed to a small group in our nation, so they are not American. We have the people have borne the cost juxtaposed to Washington. We have the government now should be controlled by the people, so it's not Washington. Yeah? So it's very clear how he constructs a new cleavage in the American society. And thus, as most American presidents, always with a religious touch. Now, if you look at Obama, and I've just taken out some parts of his inauguration speech, which was double the length of Trump, you see that his use of the people was completely different. He included himself always and everybody into the American people. So it's we, the people, those of us. We restore the trust between the people and their government. And then he talks about other people, other countries. So it's a completely different use and meaning of the people. And if you look at it even in numbers, you see that Obama's speech was double the length almost of Trump's speech, and the use of America and the people was almost America double than with Trump than with Obama. So even repetition is a very strong rhetorical device, but it's also the collocation. How is it defined in the speech? And just very briefly, because Madame Le Pen is up for election in France and Macron, you see the way she uses le peuple. And I will not translate the whole thing, but it's sort of the decision of the American people. Here she congratulates Trump to his victory, and it's she connects liberté, freedom, with the people. The people are sort of guarantee freedom. That's what the people are for. That's what the people deserve. And she talks au nom du peuple, in the voice of the people. It will be about the coming back of the freed people. So it's all about connecting freedom and the people. So what does the populist narrative look like? And just to give you a kind of spin-off, which Paul Chilton just also summarized in an excellent paper. So we start off with, once upon a time, there were three separate peoples. And we nationalist populists are helping to bring that back, and then retrospective, into the earlier and better order, like it has been before. And we find a lot of grammatical means to do that, but basically it triggers some stored scripts of collective memories of a nostalgic better time, like before the civil rights movement, when the countries were still homogeneous, white, etc. So all these speeches actually have an impact to establish the right-wing populist and nationalist vision of the world. So I come to my end. I think it's very important to see that legitimacy is now being redefined. Legitimation is always very important for politicians, representation, legitimation. But now we have what Abulov calls popular legitimacy. The legitimacy is given by the feeling of the people, and actually avoids the democratic institutions or hollows them out. Legitimacy, as he says, has become the absolute horizon of modern politics. So I will skip this slide, although I'd love to tell you more about the media, and just go to what kind of counter strategies are possible. And I think this is an important issue to discuss. Up to date, we have had either isolation, cordon sanitaire, or integration, embracing these parties and hoping that when you embrace them, they will die, which doesn't happen. And we see right now in Turkey, in Hungary, and Poland that these parties thrive very well once they're in power, and that they very quickly destabilize democratic institutions. So long-term strategies must be aimed at political education beyond just reframing or some moralistic formulas. But I think much more important is we have to understand what the social and historical roots are of the rise of right-wing populism, because otherwise different visions and different agenda and different programs will be hard to find. And I also don't think that only the media are to blame. Yeah, the media have an important part in this game, but it would be much too easy to only blame everything on the media. I think that there is so much inequality right now in some of the societies on the one hand, and an emphasis on identity politics on the other hand. And both these things, these dimensions come together. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Anja,
Can I stay here so I can, or?
no, you can just come back. We'll save the questions for the debate. Okay, so thank you for a very interesting talk. I've prepared comments mainly in relation to your book. So now I'm sort of trying to combine the impressions of to see how that goes. So there is a number of issues that I would like to discuss later, but in this comment I wanted to discuss how right-wing populism relates to other political projects and movements, just to sort of put it in a broader context. So in your book, you describe right-wing populism as an antagonistic division between the constructed people and whomever this given political project defines as the elite. I generally agree with that, but the only thing that I disagree with is how you describe it as arbitrary, but I'll come back to that. You also argue that a central characteristic of right-wing populist discourse is antagonistic Manichaean divisions, black and white representations of good and bad, friends and foes, we and the other. But these characteristics, I would argue, are true of any political project. Political discourse is simplistic, and it has to be, because it's precisely this construction of a clear frontier that makes political mobilization and action possible. So I don't know that much about the discourse in the countries that you studied, so I wanted to give an example from Norway instead. And I've also found, well, in Norway there are at least 4 antagonistic fronts in the debate. And I've found similar patterns in the US as well, when I studied political movements there. So the first, let me just get my water. Okay, so the first, which resembles the ones you described, is organized around the division between the people and the elite. But this is not any given elite. It's the educated middle class that dominate the media, that define what counts as legitimate knowledge, and sort of interfere with people's lives through the state bureaucracy. In Norway, this type of anti-elitism is promoted by 2 very different parties, the Center Party, the Rural Party, and the Social Conservative and Neoliberal Progress Party. And whereas the Center Party wants to protect the national sovereignty from the EU, the Progress Party is much more concerned with immigrations that threatens what they perceive as our culture. The second division, or the second discourse, sees the conflict between. Should I turn this off?
Yeah.
Is it distracting? Okay. So the second one sees the conflict between labor and capital as the central division of the society. And in this division, the state is not seen as a source of repression, but as a means to achieve power. So the us in this coalition is
the working class and the middle class, who sort of unite together in mutual solidarity against forces that weaken the bargaining position. They also see themselves as people. Let's see. So this discourse emerges from the left, but the left is very much divided on who they see as the other. Whereas some oppose capitalism as such, others merely criticize the neoliberal version of it. Some support the EU because it provides an arena for European trade regulations and labour solidarity, whereas others oppose it because it undermines the national struggle. So, and in time periods when there is a surplus of labour, many also see unregulated labour as immigration as a threat. So it can be also very critical to immigration that way. So the third frontier can be seen as an opposition to division as such. It's a movement for universalism. It seeks to protect groups that for various reasons face barriers in the society, such as immigrants, women, homosexuals, etc. And these groups' source of power is primarily rights, which also necessitate legitimacy. And this emphasis on universalism doesn't mean that they don't have any sort of us and them in their frontier. The them is basically anyone who challenges the principles of universalism and the legitimacy of special treatment, which means nationalists from the left as well as the right, and particularly right-wing populists who advocate traditional family values and use stigmatizing rhetoric against immigrants. So this us is a coalition of internationally oriented, largely urban middle class. They tend to gather around the Socialist Party, the Green Party, and the right-wing party called the Left. Okay, the last frontier sees the fundamental division in society as that between the responsible and enlightened against the unruly masses. So this is a fundamentally elitist discourse, so I would definitely not call this one populist. It might see democracy as the epitome of civilization, but it still wants to save it from the people. And since Brexit and the US presidential election, this discourse has become fairly widespread even at the left. So with this broader picture in mind, I wanted to make 3 comments. So the first is that when you sort of isolate right-wing populism and sort of take it out of the context of these others, it's kind of easy to forget that the rhetoric on all these sides can be pretty harsh as well. And you very easily find memes and cartoons and slogans for each and every one of these divisions. And the reason why you react on them is that you belong to another discourse. So I think from each and every perspective, you can see harsh rhetoric from another side as pretty much as hate speech. So that's one thing. Okay, and I very much admire your sort of rhetorical analysis. What I find kind of socially problematic is how you sort of take for granted your own ideological positions. You can probably sort of find out where you belong in each of these these discourses. And what is problematic about this is that there are such major disagreements about what other it's okay to fear, because every discourse it's built on fear, and some kind of fear, some kind of threat to the society. And so there are major disagreements on what it's okay to fear in the society and how you can actually express it. So the problem with sort of imposing your own discourse onto another's discourse is that you sort of alter their meaning. And I think the example you used with the Jew as the traditional scapegoat is a very good example, because it's the Jew has been used as a scapegoat in many different discourses and for very different reasons. So because Jews have been associated with with American banks. They have become sort of, in certain time periods, symbols for capitalism. But Jews have also been liberal, and they've been socialists, and and in yes, and in time periods and in historical contexts, specific social contexts, they've been accused of being socialists, basically, which sort of undermines a capitalist project. And during the whole nationalist wave in the 20s, Jews were sort of seen as a threat to the nationalist project as such, because they because they advocate sort of universalism, and because it's a very clear minority that sort of stands out and makes it very clear that this is not a united nation in a way. You can also say like currently that Jews get a lot of blame for world politics as well because of Israel and its alliance with the U.S. The Jew it's not an arbitrary scapegoat. It's always used as a symbol for something else, for like the real threat. And I think this is sort of what sort of becomes missing when you sort of see them all as the same because they come from so many different places. Okay. So finally, I was really happy that you sort of mentioned briefly counter strategies because I was hoping that we can discuss this a little bit more later. And I think the sort of general othering of right-wing populism that I think we all tend to contribute to by presenting it as something very different from ourselves. I think it contributes to its growth, and I think that's dangerous, and it's difficult to know what to do about it because I think it's possible to delegitimize small fringe groups, but once they attain a constituency, that sort of demonizing them only backfires, especially because the right-wing populism sort of thrives on being attacked by the elite or being underdogs. So sort of attempts to delegitimize them only makes them stronger and more motivated. And also, my own research shows that a central reason for political antagonism is that people feel threatened, which is something that happens when opponents sort of undermine the legitimacy of your own political identity and your own political discourse, the rhetoric you use, the words you use, which people who use those words tend to see as neutral and descriptive. So I think if we want to stop the right-wing populist tide, I think an approach that would, well, at least that I would like to discuss, is that I think we need to convince potential voters that our solutions are better, not by sort of showing them how right-wing populist discourse is incoherent and fallacious, but basically that there are better alternatives. And I think also demonizing them also just reinforces the division between this urban middle-class educated elite and the people, which I think is dangerous. So that's what I have to say for now. I'm looking forward to the discussion.